A very warm welcome to all of you to this webinar on WTO 2.0 in the post-COVID world. This is the fourth webinar in the series on reforming WTO in the 21st century, which was initiated by ICRIER in collaboration with the India office of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung last year. The first webinar in the series was centered on formulating new approaches to strengthen the multilateral trading system. The second webinar focused on possible outcomes of the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. And the third webinar discussed the role of WTO amidst a changing geopolitical landscape. As you may be aware, ICRIER is a strong advocate of free, fair, and rule-based international trade, and we believe in strengthening the global architecture that governs cross-border trade and investment. And therefore, WTO-related issues are of great interest to us and are an important focus area in our research. India is ready to engage in a more flexible manner. This is quite evident from India's commitment at COP26. India would like to be perceived as being part of the solution to global challenges. Today's webinar is going to dwell on some pressing issues that the world faces today, and these include challenges posed by the fast-growing and ever-changing digital economy, issues related to the interaction of trade and environment policies, the TRIPS agreement and the waiver, the role of trade in promoting gender equality, especially its emerging role at the WTO. I am delighted that we have been able to gather an eclectic panel of distinguished experts to deliberate on these extremely topical themes, and we're really looking forward to an engaging session today. We have with us Joerg, senior economist at UNCTAD. We have Prabhash Ranjan, who is a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School. We have with us R.V. Anuradha, who's a partner at Clarus Law Associates. We have Anoush, Boghossian, the head of the WTO Trade and Gender Unit and the WTO Gender Policy Advisor. And we also have with us today our moderator, Amiti, who is the senior deputy editor at the Hindu Business Line. Once again, our sincere thanks to CAS for supporting the series. And I now invite Mr. Pankaj Matan, who is the department head, who's the deputy head at the India CAS. He is the team leader program and deputizes for the resident representative of CAS as and when the need arises. He has authored several reports on various topics focusing on geostrategic and geoeconomic issues, and he has curated many programs around it and several projects with several institutions. He has built several partnerships with political parties, think tanks, and institutions, and he has written extensively. We have partnered with CAS for several years, and we're really very proud of this partnership, particularly in this one, which is of great relevance today in India and around the world. May I now invite Pankaj to also give the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Nisha, and thank you for the kind words as well. And let me reciprocate when I say that we are also indeed very proud of our partnership with ICRIER. And so coming to my remarks, this very, very marvelous panel of experts, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a great privilege to welcome you all to the fourth and the last webinar of another timely and pivotal webinar series initiated by ICRIER and the India office of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, which is focusing on reforming the WTO. The background was given very nicely by Nisha. Let me come to the current webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in uncertain times, that's for sure, with even the multilateral system being called up into question and the WTO positioned at the center of this criticism. In 2001, it launched an ambitious round of negotiations, the Doha round as it is known, which aimed to extend the scope of negotiations, starting with the thorny issue of agriculture and to better protect the interests of developing and emerging nations. However, today, after a little more than 2 decades, the situation has remained largely unchanged, and only a few sectoral agreements involving a limited group of countries have been reached. Additionally, and in stark contrast to the seemingly unalterable WTO rules, the world economy has changed a great deal at an ever-increasing pace over this short period of time, and mostly negatively so. Deep economic and geopolitical shifts are influencing production, trade, power relations among WTO countries. More recently, especially after the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath, populist reservations about free trade have also increased, preparing the ground for protectionism and trade wars. All these problems have been further exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as, of course, by this infamous pandemic that has far from ceased to have a negative impact on the global economy, as evidenced by the large-scale lockdowns being carried out in China even in the past few weeks. But I'm not here to be the prophet of gloom and doom in my words of welcome, for we are not gathered virtually today to bemoan the failures of the past, but to discuss the future of the WTO. And as the famous saying goes, the greater the challenge, the greater the reward. Or as the first ever woman and first ever African Director General of the WTO, Okonjo Iweala, has put it, the WTO requires to be rebuilt and transformed. Hereby, international rules and national policies that govern trade and markets need to be adapted, sharpened, or even first created to keep pace with changes we have not seen in such drastic forms since the Industrial Revolution. Dear ladies and gentlemen, let me seize this opportunity to bring forward an issue that I consider crucial for the rebuilding of the WTO and re-establishment of its former luster. Call it a stone being cast in a pool of this marvelous intellects that we have in the panel here, and I want to observe the ripple effect. I am hereby referring to intellectual monopoly capitalism, which the researchers Cedric Durand and Cecilia Recap have quite rightly described as the challenge of our times in a recent and widely acclaimed article. Intellectual monopolies today constitute a form of private property involving rights similar to those manifested in a house or plot of land, but monopolies are no longer seen as obstacles to trade, but as essential conditions for the smooth functioning of markets. Yet, when knowledge becomes private property, it restricts the freedom of others to use it, even when it has been independently acquired. Private ownership of a house, for example, does not limit the freedom to build other houses and only limits the freedoms of others in a particular place. Intellectual property rights, ladies and gentlemen, can limit the freedoms of individual anywhere in the world. How dangerous this concept of intellectual monopolies can be has been very aptly shown in the wake of the pandemic with regards to patents for COVID-19 vaccines being restricted in the hands of a few and thus made inaccessible to millions of others, if not billions. If this unfair practice is to be tamed, the WTO must be reformed. A statute should stipulate that fair participation in international trade requires that a fraction of each member state's gross national product be invested in scientific research made available to all countries as a global public good. If nation states are not to be invested again with the powers necessary to strike a balance between public and privatized knowledge, it is also necessary to have an authority linked to the WTO that determines when knowledge should be usable by all, because its private appropriation causes too much damage to society. And very importantly, this examination should be done continuously and not only in emergency situations like the present pandemic. At a time when privatized knowledge is blocking many innovative investments, its partial transfer from private to the public sphere could have enormous multiplier effects that could help to revive the global economy. New avenues would be open for those who were deprived of the use of knowledge, while former monopolists, compensated with adequate monetary returns and exposed to greater competition, would have an incentive to increase their investments rather than increase their monopoly returns. Such changes could indeed generally mark the emergence of a WTO 2.0. Having said that, and in conclusion, it should be evident to all of us that positive change within the WTO is not possible without cooperation, collaboration, and consensus. We shall have to harness those three ever important C's to breathe fresh life into the words of our Honorable Finance Minister, Her Excellency Madam Nirmala Sitharaman, who famously stated, the WTO is the only multilateral system in which developing and developed countries sit together at par. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. I would now request Amiti Sen to take over the moderation of this session. Amiti is and Foreign Affairs and has been writing extensively on both domestic and global trade issues. We are all familiar with her writings on the WTO issues. She has attended several of the WTO ministerial meetings, and we have very keenly followed her writings after the ministerials. We are very fortunate to have her with us. Thank you, Amiti, for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Nisha, for such a generous introduction. A big hello to everyone who has joined in today. I thank ICRIER-KAS for making me part of this very timely webinar. We are just about 6 weeks away from the WTO Ministerial Conference scheduled in Geneva, and there are so many issues that members are grappling with. We have not had a ministerial meet in 4.5 years. The WTO appellate body is dysfunctional. The COVID-19 disruptions have added to protectionism across the globe. No wonder the call for reforms at the WTO is growing louder. But perspectives differ over the kind of reforms the WTO should go in for. What should WTO 2.0 be about? That's the big question that many are seeking the answer to. Since 2019, a number of WTO members have started plurilateral negotiations under the joint initiatives flag in a number of areas, e-commerce and gender issues being two prominent among them. The following year in 2020, a number of countries came together to start structured discussions on trade and environment sustainability. The same year in October, India and South Africa came up with a proposal for a temporary waiver in TRIPS obligations on COVID-19 vaccines and medical tools. Our panel of experts today will take us through recent developments in some of these important areas under discussion and talk about the relevance. We will be holding 2 rounds of discussion. In the first round, each speaker would give a detailed talk on their specific areas and raise all relevant issues. And in the second round, we will go in for suggestions. They would basically give suggestions on the concerns that were raised in the first round. We can then follow it up with questions from participants who can send their questions through the chat box. Well, it's my pleasure to start the discussions now. Let me introduce our first speaker to you, George Maya. He's a senior economist at the UNCTAD, where he is part of the team that prepares UNCTAD's annual trade and development report. Before joining the UN, he was an economist in the International Department of the German Central Bank. He was special advisor to UNCTAD Secretary General in 2015-16 and a visiting fellow with the Department of International Development at Oxford. He has published widely on economic issues, including in the review of World Economics, the World Economy, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Development Studies. He holds a PhD degree in economics and the European University Institute in Florence. Welcome, George. George, the area that you will be highlighting today, I think, is data flow and digital trade. It is an area which is gaining increasing significance in the global economy and also at the WTO. Although a work program was established at the WTO way back in 1998 to examine trade-related issues around global e-commerce, not too much has happened around it, over the last couple or maybe 3 decades. Then in 2019, more than 75 WTO members launched a separate initiative with the aim of establishing global rules on e-commerce. India is one country which has refused to be part of the joint sectoral initiative and also has questioned its legality. But discussions under the initiative have been progressing steadily and may also come up at the WTO MC12 next month. It is true that digital commerce is increasing by leaps and bounds. Also after COVID-19, its significance has hugely increased. George, do you think that it is time for rules on digital economy, trade and data to be discussed at a multilateral level at the WTO?
Thank you very much, Amiti, for this introduction. Thank you also for the organizer of this series and for the invitation, for inviting me to this panel. Now, I think before we discuss the legal frameworks for the digital economy and cross-border flows of data, it is important to understand the role of data in the digital economy. Now, in general, there's wide agreement that data are at the heart of the digital economy and that data are a crucial economic asset. However, data are multidimensional. They affect many economic areas, including trade, but also finance, production, and taxation, but also many non-economic areas, including health, the environment, national security, and human rights, such as privacy of data. And I think to formulate appropriate policies and appropriate legal frameworks, it is important to understand the multidimensional nature of data. However, such an understanding is hampered by an absence of a generally accepted definition of data. There is also no measure of data flows that would allow tracing the economic and social values of data and ensure an inclusive and fair sharing of related benefits. And it is also important to understand that raw data have little economic value. Instead, it's the ability to access, process, analyze, and use data that provides economic benefits. Now, the objective of legal frameworks in the digital area, I think, should be for developing countries no longer to remain at the periphery of the digital economy, but rather to be able to bridge existing digital and data gaps. Now, regarding national legal frameworks, there are many developing countries that so far have no frameworks that would rule who can store, process, or use their data. The absence of such national legal framework risks providing first mover advantages and ensuring monopoly powers to existing global platforms, most of which are headquartered in advanced economies. With no legal frameworks in place in developing countries, these platforms are able to use the data of developing countries and appropriate their economic value, leaving little, if any, benefits to those providing the data. Regarding international legal frameworks, it is clear that developing countries are able to influence international legal frameworks only by participating in related negotiations and debates. However, the developmental outcome of such legal frameworks very much depends on the perspective from which they are approached and the inclusiveness of the related forum. Now, such international legal frameworks have in fact been increasingly been treated as part of trade agreements. The underlying perspective is that restrictions on data flows should be treated like any other trade barrier and generally minimized. This is the case, for example, for so-called multi-regionals, such as the CPTPP. It is also part of RCEP, which, however, is where these rules are not yet operational, and it's also part of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, where it's part of the second phase. Now, I think that including data issues in mega regional risks fragmentation that may enshrine oligopolistic market power structures and hamper inclusiveness and therefore amplify existing inequalities. Now, striving to subject the digital economy to trade rules also regards recent activities related to the joint statement initiatives at the WTO, as you had just mentioned. the legitimacy of such joint statements initiative is open to questions, and there are some who argue that their justification rely on a tenuous interpretation of WTO rules. Moreover, the direction and agenda of these activities relate to initial text, which may be seen as reflecting the interests mainly of the advanced economies and big platforms, without taking equally account of the interests of those at the periphery of the digital economy. And in fact, even ongoing regulatory measures in the United States and the European Union deviate from the main thrust that guided this text and explicitly address market structure. In the interest of time, I won't give any examples now, but there are also more general doubts as to the appropriateness of attempts to govern the digital economy and data through trade agreements. For one, a large proportion of data is not linked to any trade flow. This is the case, for example, with the use of foreign online services, such as internet search engines or social media platforms, where users generate a cross-border flow of data that the service provider process and monetize, but there are no, there's no engagement in trade flows. But more generally, trade roles were developed for goods and services that are produced and cease to exist when they are consumed. By contrast, using data does not imply their consumption and cessation of existence. Rather, data are intangible and non-rival. This means that many people can use the same data simultaneously and over time without them being depleted. Data also often have positive externalities, such as by combining them with other data or through network effects of the digital platforms. So my conclusion would be that it would not be a good idea to include the digital economy and data under trade agreement, but rather approaching the digital economy from a development perspective and ensuring inclusiveness of related legal frameworks would be achieved best by a debate under the auspices of the United Nations. Let me stop here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, George. So maybe in the second round, we will take forward what you have suggested, that how UN platform may be a better forum to take forward all discussions and rulemaking and the way forward for developing discussions on data and data flow. So I think now let us move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Anuradha. Anuradha is a partner at Clarus Law Associates. It's in New Delhi, and she specializes in issues relating to international trade and investment law and policy and international environment law and policy. She advises companies, industry associations, and the Indian government on issues arising under the WTO, FTAs, and bilateral investment treaties, including disputes arising under such agreements. She's also an external consultant with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the International Trade Center. She teaches at various training sessions and capacity building programs on trade law and policy, and is an honorary professor at various national law schools in India and external faculty with the World Trade Institute, Bern. Anuradha will today delve into the very important subject of trade, environment, and sustainability and its interplay at the WTO. Welcome, Anuradha. Trade and environment have been part of the WTO since its inception. Since the 2001 Doha round, there were dedicated sessions at the Committee on Trade and Environment on environmental goods and services, and India too was an active participant. So what happened to all that? I mean, there was so much enthusiasm right from the beginning of the Doha round. So where did it all fizzle out? And why was there, this need to constitute the trade and environment sustainability structured discussions? So would you also tell us whether it is actually a new avatar of the earlier discussions? And also, where does sustainable development fit into the trade environmental discourse?
Thank you, Amiti. Thank you, Nisha, and to KAS Panteji for making this wonderful platform happen. And this has been a stimulating set of discussions in your past few webinars. And I think George has set a wonderful pace for this particular session as well. Amiti, thanks for the introductory questions. And as you rightly pointed out, environment has found a place in the WTO agreements from the beginning. And in fact, in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement itself, both the terms sustainable development and environment find place. In terms of sustainable development, there is really no internationally agreed definition in a legal instrument, but it is widely understood to comprise of 3 pillars. And those pillars constitute the economic pillar, the environmental pillar, and the social pillar. Of course, there is more recent literature which talk about the cultural pillar and perhaps the human health aspects. And it is an evolving concept as we speak. In terms of where the WTO posited it, the preambular paragraph that deals with sustainable development and environment in the very first paragraph of the Marrakesh Agreement represents the very tenuous dynamics on how environment operates in relation to a trade agreement. So it's a very nicely drafted paragraph. It's almost running into 7 to 8 lines, but at the end of the day, what it talks about is the emphasis that the protection and preservation of environment needs to go hand in hand with the enhancement of the means to do so, given the varying needs and concerns of countries at different levels of economic development. And this, to a large extent, resonates with what we find more in environmental agreements. There is a different set of international legal instruments under the United Nations, which has a fairly complex set of environmental agreements that have emerged primarily since the 1970s. And of course, the most famous one being the Climate Change Convention, which captures the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities of countries in achieving what is seen as a global environmental concern, which is climate change. So far, as far as trade agreements are concerned, as far as the WTO is concerned, it has always considered the environmental issues as an exception to trade agreements. Because one of the overarching concern has been the fear that, or the risk that using of environment as a measure in a trade agreement could become a proxy for a protectionist measure. So to draw the line in order to ward off that risk, WTO agreements have mandated that environmental measures should not be applied in a manner which results in arbitrary or unjustified discrimination between countries or a disguised restriction on trade. So that's the principle of exception within the WTO. And of course, there are other agreements such as the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement and the SPS agreement under WTO, which allow countries the right to enact measures, including on ground for protection of plant, animal life and health, on grounds of environmental concerns, provided certain legitimate policy objectives have to be met. And again, the overarching concern that this should not become arbitrary or protectionist is inbuilt into those agreements. And I think it's important to keep that in context. In 2001, as you rightly mentioned, with the Doha round, the trade and environment discussions was put up as one of the areas focusing on discussions on the interplay between trade and multilateral environmental agreements. There were some excellent papers that came out from the WTO Secretariat mapping trade measures across multilateral environment agreements which had been, which had arisen under the aegis of the United Nations system. So all of that was going on, and of course there were extremely active discussions on the issue of liberalization of environmental goods and services the key proponents of environmental goods trade liberalization were the developed countries. Countries like India, Argentina, Brazil provided certain alternative approaches. And the thrust of their approaches was more arising out of the concern that environmental goods, a list of category of environmental goods may not necessarily have pure environmental purposes. There could be dual purposes which might actually defeat the overall use of tariff liberalization, or it may lead to a misuse of tariff liberalization. So India came up with a very interesting concept called the project approach. And then we also had another approach by Argentina called the integrated approach. These discussions were proactively going on, I would say, till around 2011 or 12. And thereafter, there was, as with a lot of matters at the WTO, it kind of fizzled out over the last, since I would say 2012. As with various other initiatives, I think you briefly mentioned in the introductory session that since 2017, the format of discussions at the WTO has changed, and we have more of these joint initiatives coming up, plurilateral initiatives. The first of which you mentioned was the domestic regulations and services, which is seeing a legal outcome. As far as trade and environment is concerned, there was a proposal from a group of over 50 countries, which includes EU, China, Japan, Canada, US, which have proposed the discussions on trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, the TESSD, along a very, very similar format as a joint initiative. In terms of the agenda for what they're going to be talking about, there is, you mentioned this is it a new avatar of the EGS discussions? I would say yes and no, because there is certainly EGS in terms of tariff liberalization for environmental goods and services is still an important component, but it is also talking about newer issues, including the emergence of the need to have some kind of a common platform to discuss climate change measures, including carbon border measures. The EU has already come up with a proposal. US has been talking about a carbon tax, so UK is already talking about replicating the EU CBAM proposal. So all of that is perhaps necessitating the TESSD discussion to take a holistic view on some of these issues. There are concerns though. Coming back to, let's just take the environmental goods and services. George would know this because it's the Trade and Development Report of UNCTAD, which notes, it gives the illustration of the OECD's combined list of environmental goods. And it notes that the top exporters of these goods include EU, China, US, and Japan, whereas the net importers would be developing countries. And then it makes its economic assessment that tariff liberalization of these goods would mean a revenue loss of close to 15 billion USD for developing countries. It then raises the question that, is this a revenue loss that is justifiable, or can the revenue generation be then productively used for an environmental purpose as a national policy goal? What really, can there be a mandate for reducing tariff purely as, on the pretext that this is an environmental good? Related aspect that it raises is how much of carbon dioxide is embodied in international trade. And the report notes, it estimates that carbon dioxide emissions embodied in international trade as a share of global emissions, taking the benchmark year of 2015, was only 27.2%, which would indicate that carbon emissions generated to produce goods and services consumed domestically, as opposed to that which is traded, will have a much higher share in global carbon emissions. And therefore argues that any true and transformative climate adaptation can be more effectively addressed through domestic policies rather than through trade measures. In fact, trade measures will raise the larger question in terms of inequities. And the reason I say that is because I briefly mentioned in the beginning that environmental issues as a matter of right, as a matter of obligations, has not been dealt with at the WTO. WTO has had a very narrow, limited focus on environmental measures, whereas there is a different specialized regime under the UN, which has been dealing with balanced agreements on environmental issues. And one of the key examples is that of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, let's just take the one simple example of what EU has proposed in relation to the carbon border adjustment measure, because it is certainly holds the, has kind of led the way in terms of what such unilateral measures they actually do. And in effect, what it says, what EU is saying is that if you want to enter, if your country wants to send goods to my country, it needs to have a legal regulatory regime governing climate change that is equivalent to the EU in terms of what it seeks to achieve. Now, this fundamentally, in very simple layman terms, will go against what the UNFCCC says in the terms of balance of rights and obligations, which is that every country will notify its nationally determined contributions based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. NDCs are not uniform. There's no one size fits all. Given that as the legal regime, what EU is saying is that irrespective of whether you are compliant with your Paris Agreement NDCs, nationally determined contributions, if you want to export to the EU, you will need to buy a carbon certificate or else show that your legal regime is equivalent to mine. So to a large extent,
I think there's some problem at Anuradha's end.
Yeah, I think she's just logged off and she might log in again. Let's give it just a few seconds while she logs on. Let's move on to the next panelist, I think. There's trouble, I think. And we'll bring her on as and when she connects.
Right.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. So I think Anuradha has already, got across quite a few points, important points in the talks stand at the WTO at the moment and what needs to be done. I think in the second round, Nisha, she may want to just take it further. So meanwhile, we move on to our next speaker. Our next panelist is Prabhash Ranjan. Prabhash is a professor and vice dean at the Jindal Global Law School, OP Jindal Global University. He holds a PhD in law from King's College London and is a recipient of the British Chevening Scholarship. He teaches and publishes in the area of international investment law and international trade law. Earlier, he worked as an associate professor at the South Asian University. He has also taught at the National Law University, Jodhpur, and the National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata. Prabhash has been a visiting scholar at Brookings, India, and a visiting fellow at the Center for International Law, Cambridge University. He was a member of the team that drafted the 260th report of the Law Commission of India on the 2015 draft model Indian BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty. Prabhash has also authored a book on India and bilateral investment treaties. Welcome, Prabhash. You will be talking to us today on this very current and important issue of temporary waiver of TRIPS provision for COVID-19 vaccines and medical tools proposed by India and South Africa. Those who are closely following the matter would know that there is finally a draft which has been presented by the WTO Secretariat to the TRIPS Council, and the TRIPS Council will be meeting tomorrow to discuss it. So Prabhash, it would be great if you tell us a bit about how waivers work at the WTO. Specifically, what all does the waiver that has been proposed by India and South Africa entail? Well, the draft that was leaked the draft text on TRIPS waiver that was leaked last month. That has been criticized by several civil society organizations on the ground, that it falls way short of what was proposed by India and South Africa. And now we have a draft that has been officially submitted to the TRIPS Council. So if you could throw some light on what this whole storm is all about and what is at stake.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking ICRIER-KAS for this kind invitation, in particular to Professor Nisha Taneja. This is a very timely topic and a very timely discussion. And to answer Amiti's question, let me first give a very brief introduction about the concept of waiver under WTO law. So if we look at the WTO agreement, it clearly provides that in certain situations, countries can waive or can sort of move away from their WTO obligations, and this waiver can be provided. Historically speaking, there have been instances where these waivers have been provided. And specifically in context of TRIPS, the very well-known example of this waiver is the waiver that was decided in 2003 in the wake of the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa. And as per the 2003 decision, it was decided that certain TRIPS obligations would be waived in order to increase the accessibility of medicines in countries that lacked manufacturing capability. However, this waiver was subject to stringent requirements, because of which in the last 2 decades or so, hardly any country has been able to make effective use of this waiver. And I would say that the developed countries serving the interests of their pharmaceutical firms are all set to triumph once again over public health concerns of humanity. And we are going to witness the history repeating itself. And let me explain that how I think that history is going to repeat itself. Now, what was the original proposal that was made by India and South Africa in October 2020? The proposal that was made by India and South Africa was for a comprehensive waiver, because the idea was that intellectual property might act as an impediment towards a faster production, faster accessibility of COVID-19 medical products. And therefore, there should be a temporary waiver from a host of TRIPS obligations. This waiver should apply to all kinds of COVID-19 medical products. It should not be just about vaccines. It should also cover diagnostics, therapeutics, etc. However, after almost 1.5 years of negotiations or dragging the feet, in March last year, we learned about a leaked text, which Amiti mentioned. And now we hear that it is the same text, it is the same leaked text with some additional square brackets, which has been proposed as the official document on which negotiations are going to happen towards the adoption of a waiver in the ministerial conference in June. Now, I'm going to offer 5 critical comments about this waiver and where I think it kind of falls short of what India and South Africa had initially proposed. The first point is that the draft waiver has a product restriction. I'm calling it a draft waiver because it's still a work in progress. So the draft waiver has a product restriction. In other words, it includes only COVID-19 vaccines and not other COVID-19 medical products. Now, this is a major handicap because medicines also play an equally important role in combating the pandemic. So for example, if we look at the World Health Organization, it has recommended baricitinib for treating severe or critical COVID-19. But according to MSF, the generic version of baricitinib is not available in many countries because it is patented. So even if there is a TRIPS waiver of the kind that is being proposed, we are not going to get drugs such as baricitinib get the advantage of this particular waiver. So the first restriction in terms of restricting it to vaccines is a huge setback. Second critique, the draft waiver has an IP restriction. In other words, India and South Africa's proposal was to have a comprehensive TRIPS waiver that would cover all IP rights. But what we have instead, or at least what has been proposed instead, is only to waive patents and not other IP rights. Now, this is problematic because accessibility of COVID-19 medical products can be held up due to many IP rights, not just patents. Trade secrets, for example, is a very important IP right because of which accessibility can be impacted. Third, even on the issue of patents, the draft waiver appears to be an old wine in a new bottle. For instance, the draft waiver allows countries to limit the exclusive rights conferred on patent holders under Article 28.1 of the TRIPS agreement through the use of Article 31, which basically permits the issuance of compulsory licenses. But this flexibility is already available under the TRIPS agreement. So what is new that the draft waiver is offering? The only thing that the draft waiver offers is a waiver from Article 31F, which basically requires countries to ensure that products produced under a compulsory license are predominantly for the domestic market. So the draft waiver says that, or it basically allows countries to export any proportion of vaccines to eligible countries. But even this waiver is subject to several notification requirements, such as eligible members are obligated to prevent re-exportation of COVID-19 vaccines that they have imported. Furthermore, the eligible countries which issue a compulsory license for COVID-19 vaccines have to notify the WTO about the entity that has been authorized to produce the product, the quantities, the duration, and the list of countries to which the vaccines are being exported. Now, my submission is that all these procedural requirements will increase the transaction costs and it may deter countries from actually using the system. Not just this, the waiver actually adds a new TRIPS plus obligation. Article 31A of the TRIPS agreement requires that permission for compulsory licenses shall be considered on a product-by-product basis. Concerning Article 31A, the draft waiver clarifies that a single authorization may be given to use the subject matter of multiple patents necessary for the production of COVID-19 medicines or vaccines. However, this entails an obligation to identify and list all covered patents. Now, this is not present in the TRIPS agreement. So this is the TRIPS plus part that I'm talking about, which comes in the draft waiver. My fourth point is that the draft waiver is not universal. Only those developing countries that exported less than 10% of world exports of COVID-19 vaccines in 2021 are covered for exportation and importation. Now, this part is in square brackets. If we apply this strictly, then countries such as China will be outside the ambit of the waiver. So the waiver is not universal, which again defeats the very purpose of having the waiver. And my final point is that the draft waiver waives the obligation of a member to protect undisclosed information submitted before a drug regulator to claim marketing approval. But it is starkly silent on overcoming the challenges posed by protection to other trade secrets, which are covered under Articles 39.1 and 39.2 of the TRIPS agreement. So the draft waiver is a huge disappointment. It is a huge letdown. It is a classic case of too little, too late. I know I must be provoking many of you, but it represents a significant climb down from the original proposal that India and South Africa had made. Now, I hear that India is yet to officially say yes to this waiver, and it is still sticking to its original position. If that is the case, then that's good news. But if India has moved away from its position, and if India is behind this waiver along with US and EU, then I think India has clearly compromised its position for reasons which I don't know. But this waiver, if it gets adopted, will only be a symbolic or maybe not even a symbolic victory and will not help us in fighting the pandemic. I'll stop here, Amiti. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabhash. Maybe in the second round, we can take forward, what according to you is the ideal thing to be done at the WTO as far as TRIPS waiver is concerned. We will now next move on to our panelist, Anoush der Boghossian. I got your name correct? Okay. So Anoush is the head of the WTO Trade and Gender Unit and the WTO Gender Policy Advisor. She has more than 16 years experience in the WTO. She was appointed as the WTO's first trade and gender expert by former Director General Roberto Azevedo in 2017. She is a WTO expert on trade and gender equality and on gender equality issues. She is a recognized researcher and trainer on gender responsive trade policy. She's also one of the co-authors of the WTO World Bank report on women and trade and has published articles and working papers on trade and gender. Thank you. Thank you, Anoush, for being here. Well, gender issues, they were not much talked about, maybe also in the previous decade, like if you may. So, but they're slowly but surely gaining prominence at many forums, and WTO is not an exception. Some issues that have taken on a new form at the WTO, such as e-commerce or environment, have been under discussion under WTO in one form or the another, or under one form or another for a very long time. Some of them have been there right from the very inception. So how did the issue of trade and gender come about in the WTO? And also, how can trade policy strengthen women and bring about gender equality in trade? Can you just share your views on these issues?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Amiti, and thank you for the organizers to have me on in this panel. Well, actually, it's very simple. Actually, the issue of gender was never discussed in the WTO until I would say 2016, 2017. It was the organization was really what we could call at the time gender blind, because the idea was to say, well, we have all these rules of WTO, all these rules that govern international trade, and they are actually gender neutral. That is to say, they implement equally to men and women. So they apply equally to men and women. So basically, we don't need to talk about this. We're fine on that front, basically. Another thing which was very widely spread in WTO at the time was to say that gender issues were mostly human rights issues, and it's not part of the mandate of the WTO. It's part of the UN mandate, so it was really out of the scope of the organization. So that was the thinking in the last decades prior to, I would say, 2017, 2016. I would say it's a new issue, and it's not a new issue in a sense. Although I've just said that it was not discussed in the WTO, but let me take you back to the preamble of the WTO treaty and to the objectives of the WTO. And one of the key objectives of the WTO is about sustainable development. And if you look at, as Anuradha was saying about, sustainable development, the three pillars, one of them is social, and this relates directly to women's empowerment and to gender equality. So there was some sort of a implicit, let's say, somehow implicit mandate for the WTO to work on it, but they didn't really grab it. I'm also saying that it's not that new in WTO, so it's not really a surprise in a sense that we're talking about this. Also, is because gender equality was also really an integral part of the Aid for Trade initiative since the beginning. So the Aid for Trade initiative was born from the Hong Kong Ministerial Conference in 2005 and was operationalized by WTO members in 2006. With very key recommendations, and as part of these recommendations, they wrote that gender equality is a cross-cutting issue throughout the Aid for Trade initiative. So that was really recognized already in 2006. Also, in our technical assistance plans, the issue of gender has also been raised since, I think, 2004, and from 2018, members have mandated the WTO Secretariat to develop a training program on trade and gender, actually. So we can see that this was already some sort of either implicit or explicit mandates, but they were not really before, I would say 2017, really, let's say, grabbed by members and really introduced in the organization for discussion or for working on them, actually. So this is something which I think we could really say that WTO members really started to discuss this issue concretely in the WTO since 2017, and it all started on a very informal path. So the informal path was the Buenos Aires Declaration, which was, let's say, launched in the margins of the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference in 2017. And that declaration actually is super informal, I would say. It doesn't have any reference document, the official reference document, the official reference for WTO documents, for example, the way that we have whenever we produce any sort of decisions or communications, we always have that symbol. It doesn't have that symbol. It doesn't even have the WTO logo. So it's kind of one text on a blank page, let's say. So it's already very informal. Then the text itself is very informal as well. It talks mostly about sharing information and best practices on gender related trade policies, for example, or on sex disaggregated data collection. The text also identifies some monitoring mechanisms that are in the WTO to gather information on trade and gender. That is to say, the Aid for Trade, for example, so Aid for Trade monitoring and evaluation exercise, as well as the trade policy review mechanism. So, the text itself, the format of it is very informal. The text is also very informal in a sense. It's just about, collaboration and starting to discuss the issue. And so what happened then, since that declaration was launched, members conducted a series of thematic workshops in the WTO for the first time. So the first time they used the declaration to bring the issue in the organization so that they could talk about this issue of trade and gender. And also to further understand the links between trade and gender, because still at the time, at least for the WTO, it was not so clear about, what are the links, what is the impact of trade, if we, what is the experience, what are trade policies looking at when they were talking about women's empowerment and gender equality. So that was a bit somehow a bit blurry for WTO members. And so these thematic workshops also sort of put some light into the issues and also strengthen the understanding of WTO members on these issues. And then after these discussions, these very informal discussions, at some point members said, okay, now we need to go to the next level. We really need to start start working on these issues. For the moment, it was discussing these issues, understanding the issues. Now it's about working about these issues. So working about these issues is about, for example, how to make gender responsive trade policies, for example, how to collect data in trade that is differentiated between men and women, so that we know, where women stand in trade, and and members know how they can develop policies that can address the specific needs of women, instead of just drafting a policy without knowing, from thin air, and without knowing, without addressing the issues that women are facing on the ground. So that's something which they said. And so basically they said, okay, well, let's create an informal working group on trade and gender. And this is what they've done in September 2020. The group was created. It regroups, I think, about 127 WTO members and observers. So it's about more than 70% of the WTO membership. It's still a plurilateral initiative. It's not multilateral as of yet. But still, we have a very, as I said, more than 75% of the membership. It's the biggest group actually in the WTO, I would say. And this is what they've done. So the way that they've introduced the issue in WTO is going from a very informal path to institutionalizing the issue in the organization. And now they're also looking at taking a step further to really look at these issues. Because they are basing their work on 4 pillars that they have identified as being very fundamental to advancing women's economic empowerment. And these 4 pillars are, for example, as I said, data collection. It's about understanding research that can inform trade policy making. It's about better mainstreaming gender into aid for trade programs and initiatives. It's also looking at the WTO from a gender lens perspective. Maybe I can talk about this aspect a bit later. So this is something that really, the way that they've looked at this issue from the work that they've been doing in the informal working group on trade and gender. And through that work, actually, it has further strengthened WTO members' experience, I would say, expertise in inclusive policy making in a sense. So if we're talking about policy making, so what's about, what it is about in terms of gender, what is, what does it mean exactly when you draft a policy, trade policy? How can you bring the issue of gender and women's economic empowerment into it? Well, we see that a lot of members actually have developed such trade policies. And we see that trade policies, for example, can support women in various ways. First of all, it can create economic opportunities for them in export sectors. So often we see some policies that are focusing on giving either financial or non-financial incentives to the export sectors to hire more women. So that's one aspect, and it could be very useful for these sectors, because sometimes they are facing workforce shortages. So they would need to have to invest investing in women would bring them these additional workers that they would need. For example, it's just an example. Trade policy can support, for example, and we can see that most of these trade policies are targeting women entrepreneurs and female farmers. This is not surprising, because we see that, for example, women contribute greatly to agriculture and to food security. So this is normal, that this is almost natural that trade policy would focus on female farmers, for example. And through these programs for women entrepreneurs, I would say small entrepreneurs, because mostly women entrepreneurs own very small or even micro companies. If we look at some, it's just a fact that has been looked at, and there's a lot of evidence around that. And so these policies mostly focus on building the capacity of entrepreneurs and farmers, and also focus on establishing programs to facilitate access to finance for these to target groups. I would say, I would say access to finance is very important. We may think that it's not a trade issue, but it's 100% a trade issue, because if you don't have finance, then you cannot afford the cost of trade, and trade can be very costly, especially for small entrepreneurs, for small female entrepreneurs. It means complying with certification, labeling, packaging norms. It means being knowledgeable about trade rules, or having somebody that is, a skilled staff which is not knowledgeable about trade rules. So all that together is quite important, this aspect of access to finance. Otherwise, it would be quite difficult for entrepreneurs to be able to trade.
Right. Thanks so much, Anoush, for throwing so much light on the issues that, we all know about, but we don't spend so much time, thinking deeply about. So maybe in the next round, we could also discuss some concerns related to the area. So I think it's now time we can move to the second round, and I would request all the panelists one by one to basically take forward what they had, the points that raised in the first round, and indicate how this could be taken ahead and what the solution could be. So coming first to George, you pointed out various reasons why it would be inappropriate to address data issues and those related to digital economy through negotiations for trade agreements, including at the WTO. But digital economy is a reality and needs to be governed as well as nurtured. How do you suggest this be done? You've already said that UNCTAD could be a better platform for this. So could you just, describe it a little bit more?
Yeah, thanks very much for your question. Let me also back up by saying that, as I mentioned, in order to influence international legal frameworks, one needs to participate in related negotiations, but the developmental outcome of such frameworks very much depends on the perspective from which they are approached and the inclusiveness of the related forum. And therefore, I would suggest that the United Nations, including UNCTAD, is a better place than the WTO or especially free trade agreements. A first reason is that the WTO and free trade agreements approach the digital economy and data issues from a very narrow trade angle, whereas the United Nations can adopt a holistic approach and therefore take into account also implications for market structure, taxation, data access, and consumer protection. Moreover, the United Nations process would facilitate a multi-stakeholder exchange, and it would include government representatives not only from trade ministries, but also from other ministries, as well as experts and representatives of even civil society organizations that deal with market structure and antitrust issues, technology, taxation, and so on. And as such, it would much better match the multi-dimensional nature of data that I mentioned at the beginning. I think that a United Nations process would also help to reframe the debate away from being centered on free flow of the data and instead focus on how to ensure and achieve inclusiveness and maximize the developmental impact of the digital economy. Moreover, rather than aiming at agreements on binding rules centered on the free flow of data, the United Nations process would aim at soft rules and a shared understanding of basic values and principles. And I think this approach would be instrumental in building trust and finding a shared understanding, for example, in the area of the localization of data, for which we now have three sort of prototype regimes, namely the regime favored by the United States, where the approach is that enterprises and citizens should be able to freely move data, the European Union prioritizing privacy as through the General Data Protection Regulation of 2018 that includes extensive requirements for the transfer of allowing personal data to shift outside of the European Union. And the third prototype would be China's more state-driven approach that is heavily oriented towards a broad vision of ensuring national security objectives. I think that these three prototypes reflect a difference in national and regional priorities and trying to negotiating binding rules, enshrining them in trade agreements without prior informal dialogue appears hard to be achieved. And in fact, it would risk fragmentation of the international governance in the data area with adverse impacts on inclusiveness and bridging the divides. I also think that regional activities may be a powerful complement to such global efforts. First reason for that is that existing digital and data gaps are much smaller at the regional level, so it would be easier to reach consensus on how to harmonize existing rules and standards, and therefore aim to narrow gaps at the regional level first. Regional activities would also be better suited for the creation of digital infrastructure and data sharing mechanisms that support the growth of enterprises in the developing countries and maximize inclusiveness in that way. There are a number of examples from ASEAN that point out or that illustrate how this could be done, such as the ASEAN Agreement for e-commerce or the ASEAN Framework on Personal Data Protection.
Excuse me, George, if you may just sum up in the next 2 minutes, because then I think it would be also nice to take some questions, because I think we may otherwise run out of time.
Yes. So an important feature of these agreements is that in line of the so-called ASEAN way, the agreements establish cooperation that is flexible enough to accommodate different development trajectories, and they do not establish governance in the form of legally enforceable rules. And I think as such, they provide synergies with global activities rather than with regional activities in the form of free trade agreements that I think would hamper, would risk a fragmentation. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, George. We move to Anuradha. Anuradha, would you just throw some light on how this issue of environment be tackled globally? You said that it is important to talk about it multilaterally because things have become a reality in the form of this carbon tax that is being imposed by the European Union and other such taxes also from the US. So what, according to you, would be the ideal way to look at these issues, and what role could WTO continue to play in this?
Thanks, Amiti, and sincere apologies for suddenly getting knocked off during the first session. Yeah, but I think I managed to catch most of the other panelists, so it's been good so far. In terms of the point that you're raising, yes, this is, and I think George mentioned this in the beginning, and he reiterated it now. I think the fundamental principle is the importance to engage in order to be able to put, for each country to be able to put its point forward. It's important to engage, but at the same time, it is important to see which institution is best suited, which platform is best suited to address issues of this nature across each of the areas that we've been speaking about in this panel. But specifically on the issue of environment, the point where I got knocked off was that yes, when you are having unilateral measures, if we were to look at the WTO dispute settlement system, the flagship of the institution to help and come to the rescue for a definitive interpretation, that seems to be a fanciful thought because we've been through 3.5 years without any effective dispute settlement mechanism, and there still seems to be no resolution for it. Again, where I mentioned that yes, there is a very specialized mechanism to deal with climate and climate change related issues. Not again completely optimal. We've all known the ups and downs of the UNFCCC system, the failure of the Kyoto Protocol. I wouldn't say failure, ineffectiveness of the Kyoto Protocol in actually sustaining the format of negotiations. And then we have the Paris Agreement, which is a compromise, but it has put in place a mechanism that over 193 countries have agreed to. So if you were to ask me, which is an ideal place to actually tackle these issues, perhaps it really is the UN system under the aegis of the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change itself. To tackle this particular issue, what we really need is an understanding of how carbon pricing were to operate, linked to the differential responsibility of countries. In other words, when there is a differential responsibility, there cannot be any uniform carbon pricing. Carbon pricing necessarily needs to be linked to differential responsibilities of the different carbon pricing in different countries. And the moment that is acknowledged and there is a framework that is provided for, respect and synergy with the WTO mechanism, in order to ensure that the WTO by sanctifying a particular measure does not really, a trade measure does not become a ruse or a vehicle to defeat another obligation arrived at a multilateral forum. So I think that it's important to address that. As we speak, this issue of trade and environment interface is actually seeing even more in terms of even greater provisions, even more complex provision in free trade agreements. And it's really shifting as we speak from mere exception to trade agreements to actual rights and obligations relating to not just environment, but to labor-related issues also. So it's almost as if trade agreements, because of their enforcement ability and because of the fact that they have greater ability to create a difference, it's in terms of consequences through trade sanctions, it's becoming a chosen forum to build in many of these issues. But I think as with the inability of a narrow trade mechanism to deal with multilateral dimensions of, say, data that George spoke about, equally to deal with the multidimensional aspects of the social aspect, that is labor, or of the environmental aspect, we cannot expect the trade agreement to be the magic wand which can resolve all of the world's issues. It can only, so I do see the optimal way to achieve it is to respect each sphere of activity and develop synergies and interlinkages in a far more meaningful manner.
Thanks so much, Anuradha. I would now like to ask Prabhash, Ranjan to basically tell us more about, like in the last round, you have focused on where the draft lacks and how it could affect India's interest and the interest of all developing countries. So now, according to you, what would be the ideal way out of the situation? So we have a TRIPS meeting tomorrow, and then next month also, when the WTO ministerial conference happens, so there could be a move to adopt this draft. So what do you think ideally should be done?
Yeah, so ideally speaking, Amiti, India should, or developing countries as a whole, should not accept this draft because it is not in accordance with what they had proposed, and it will not actually serve the purpose for which India and South Africa are asking for a waiver. So the waiver is not for the sake of having a waiver, but the purpose of the waiver is to enable countries, especially in those parts of the world which still remain unvaccinated. And we know very well about vaccine inequity. There are several countries in Africa where people have still not received even the first dose. So from that standpoint, it will be a huge disappointment if WTO fails to deliver on this front. And therefore, developing countries as a whole, India and South Africa, should take the lead, and they should ask for a comprehensive waiver, which goes beyond vaccines, one, and which goes beyond patents. So it should cover trade secrets and other intellectual property rights as well. A minimum of these two requirements have to be satisfied, for it to make it anything worthwhile. If these two requirements are not satisfied, and if we get what has been proposed now, then it will be as good as not having the waiver.
Thanks so much, Prabhash. Finally, Anoush, you gave a very detailed picture to us on, how WTO seeks to, look at gender and trade, and how they can be, basically there could be a synergy, a tie-up, and how trade can be used to bring about gender equity. So, there would also, you also mentioned that there are countries who have, although the majority of countries have joined the discussions, but then there are others, including India, who have not. So there are talks of, there are concerns that, gender issues could actually be used as a backdoor for, seeking more market access into developing country markets. So how real is this concern? And going forward, what shape do you see the discussion? You said that it is at a discussion stage right now. Like the first, I think the first two stages, it was described to all the members that what this entails. So how do you see this going forward at the WTO? What shape could, gender and trade take?
Thank you, Amiti. Yes, I mean, I'm well aware of these concerns indeed. And actually, I would like to just to give you a different way of looking at this, because I don't really see any in all the policies that I've looked at, or the free trade agreements that I've looked at, I don't really see gender-related concessions, honestly. I see collaboration on making trade more inclusive. I see really in FTAs, for example, we see gender provisions or even full gender chapters. But these are more about supporting the collaboration of the parties of the agreement to bring more gender equality in trade, for example. So it's not, these are, most of them are not, or at least all of them are not binding provisions. Actually, even those that relate to a dispute settlement system in the agreements, really, the way that the language of the provision is drafted would probably exclude them from the dispute settlement anyway. So it's really non-binding provisions, and it's mostly looking at how to foster women's employment, how to foster women's capacity, skills, education. It's all about, we have some agreements that are looking at fostering women's access to healthcare, for example. We also have some agreements that include the issue of violence against women. So these are issues. I don't see how including these issues in a free trade agreement would harm the economy or the status of a country that is part of such an agreement, because these are mostly these gender provisions are mostly drafted in the sense that why are they focusing on women in FTAs is because they know that trade can support women's economic empowerment. And if you support women's economic empowerment, it's all about development and poverty reduction. Because if you support women, that means you support job creations, you support entrepreneurship, you support innovation, you support, as I said, poverty reduction, in the sense that women give back their, most of their income to their families and communities. That's an obvious thing, but they reinvest their income into, for example, the education of their children, or focusing on health. They are the unpaid healthcare workers in the family, in the communities. So honestly, I don't see this being used as some countries would call this a new NTB, for example, a new non-trade barrier, because of the way that members have been talking about this. Also in terms of trade policy, as I said, trade policy only are being designed to support women at the national level. So this is something that is happening actually across the board, developing countries and from all the regions and also developed countries. So this is something which honestly, I really don't see how this could be harmful, basically. Your second part of the question was
yeah, it was basically how you could, like, what shape do you see this taking at the WTO in the future?
No, the shape. One thing I want to
you could just
to
conclude in 1 minute, because I think
yes,
we're running out
absolutely.
of time. Yeah,
it will just take even less than 1 minute. One thing I would like to say is that we've members here in the WTO. The objective is not to draft a new agreement on women, on trade and gender. That's not the objective. The really objective is really to strengthen, as I said, to strengthen their capacity to integrate these issues in their free trade agreements and in their national trade policies and national investment policies as well. So this is the idea. It's not about saying, okay, we are now working to draft this new big WTO agreement on trade and gender, because actually I think members are really well aware of that, is that the current WTO agreement offer enough, I would say, policy space to be used in order to make these agreements benefit for women. So I think this would be my concluding remark.
So I think we'll quickly go through some questions which are here in the chat box. So Anoush, there is one question for you. Would you share some successful examples of developing countries with regard to collection of gender disaggregated data? And if you could just wrap up in 1 minute, please, because we are, I think, running out of time.
Of course, yes. Well, again, this is something which is a key issue. Data collection in trade is very scarce. Even actually in developed countries. So this is a worldwide issue, I would say. But there are some exceptions, and you can see, for example, a country like Guinea-Bissau, for example, they integrate gender disaggregated data collection processes in their strategy for development, for the development of trade and exports, for example. So that's one thing. We also have Mexico through the National Institute of Geography and Statistics. They conduct gender disaggregated surveys, for example, and that provide really indicators on gender trade and development. And so the Ministry of the Economy is also participating in this data collection. So this is something which has been a key issue which has been raised by WTO members. Some of them are doing it, but it's not really done in a systematic way or being institutionalized. Often it's done on an ad hoc basis. And this is where I think this is, members actually really like to improve and these data collection processes. Of course, just one last word on this. This takes quite some resources, human resources. You need to train your statisticians. Also, you need to make sure that they include the trade aspect when they gather statistics, because you can see like countries like Bangladesh, for example, they collect data a lot on employment, on health, on all education. It's really very detailed. However, we don't see the trade aspect to it, because often when they collect statistics, sex disaggregated statistics in general, when they look at the trade issue, they include just the retail aspect of trade, not just the international trade aspect. So this is something which is also a matter of also training, resources in governments, and also consulting the right stakeholders as well.
I think it is time for me to sum up the discussions that we have had. It was a very intense round of discussions and really informative. And I think like every one of the participants is going back, gaining something out of it. George spoke about, I think you spoke about how critical economic asset data can be, and it is also a multi-dimensional thing, and you cannot look at it strictly from just the trade point of view. And you also pointed out how developing countries, they lack legal framework in the area, and they may not be in the best position to defend their interests. And developed countries which have which have been engaging with it for a long time, so companies coming from there, they could basically use data from developing countries in a way that could leave them a little vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. So you propose that a UN body may be a better forum to look at this issue as it would not look at it only from a very narrow trade angle, and there would be a more holistic approach of data access and consumer protection. And UN would basically also address all the basic concerns and the proposals that come from the developing countries. Anuradha, we had a very, very good discussion on, how important environment is in the multilateral framework at the moment because of, because of the increased emphasis on climate throughout, and also the taxes, various carbon taxes being imposed. But you very rightly pointed out that, while WTO can be a forum to discuss issues, which includes basically, these carbon pricing, but we cannot look at it as a panacea for all. So, so the current negotiations that are taking place within the UN, that may be, a good place to continue, and there could be a synergy between the discussions taking place at the WTO and the UN, but the WTO must not use trade measures to append or undermine what is happening at the climate change talks. Prabhash, you gave us a very, very detailed, a very, very detailed version of the draft that has been floating since last month, and what has probably been submitted to the WTO TRIPS Council. You pointed out how some of the provisions are very, very different from, not different, but basically it dilutes what was there in the India and South Africa proposal. And, and for the waiver to be effective, it has to be basically not only for vaccines, but for all the gamut of, of medical tools that are used to address COVID issues. And also there shouldn't be, so many notification requirements to basically implement that. And certainly we should not go TRIPS plus when we are looking at the waiver. Finally, Anoush, you pointed out that how important it is for countries and for institutions to look at policy from the gender perspective, and how it is time to make gender responsive trade policies, look at issues like, gender financing, and also I think knowledge, and the policy making should address needs of women specifically. And at the WTO, the discussions that are taking place, that is not necessarily, aiming at having some big agreement, which, some others should fear, but it is basically to enable members to understand what it is, how this can be used in the FTA effectively, and also to make their domestic policies better and gender sensitive. So I think like in this short time, we have been able to cover all these really, exciting and intricate issues. So I hand over to Nisha to basically propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Amiti. First of all, I would like to thank CAS for partnering with us for this very important subject on WTO reforms. And today we've managed to discuss a lot of pressing issues, new issues, and challenges that the world is facing today. Thank you, Amiti, for steering today's discussion and making it very engaging. Thanks, of course, to all the panelists today for sharing your knowledge, your insights on very important themes. And also thank you for sparing the time for the pre-webinar discussions, which we found very, very useful. Thank you, of course, to all the participants who have tuned in. And finally, I think the response to the series has been so amazing that we're so tempted to do yet another series very soon because of how important the subject is and how dormant it has been for the last many years. So it's time to revive it in a manner that all of us wake up to these new issues and think about how we need to deal with these issues in the coming years. Thank you, all of you, for being with us. With this, we come to the close of the webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.